You're sitting in another work meeting, nodding along to conversations that feel like elaborate performances, watching colleagues slip effortlessly into their professional personas, while something inside you quietly rebels. They're talking about synergies and deliverables, and circling back, and you find yourself wondering when everyone agreed to speak in this strange corporate poetry that means everything and nothing at once. Later, at the dinner party your partner insisted you attend, you watch the familiar dance unfold. Everyone's curating their stories, highlighting their successes, carefully editing out anything too real, too vulnerable, too human. The conversation flows like a well-rehearsed script, the humble bragging about vacation destinations, the casual mentions of achievements, the performance of having it all together. And there you are, holding your drink, smiling at the right moments, but feeling like an alien anthropologist studying a culture you can't quite join. Because somewhere along the way, you made a choice, maybe consciously, maybe not, to stop pretending. To stop laughing at jokes that aren't funny. To stop nodding enthusiastically about things that bore you. To stop saying you're fine when you're not. To stop performing the elaborate charade of being someone you're not just to make others comfortable. And the cost of that choice sits heavy in your chest like a stone you can't swallow. It's the silence that follows when you offer a genuine thought in a room full of people saying what they think they should say. It's the awkward pause when you admit you're struggling instead of maintaining the glossy facade of perpetual growth and gratitude. It's the gradual realization that choosing authenticity often means choosing loneliness. Your phone buzzes with notifications from friends who seem to navigate social media with enviable ease, crafting perfect posts that get hundreds of likes, while your honest thoughts sit in drafts, never quite feeling safe enough to share. They've mastered the art of being relatable without being too real, vulnerable without being too messy, authentic without being too authentic. And so you find yourself in this strange, quiet space, too honest for shallow connections, but perhaps too guarded for the deep ones you crave. Caught between a world that rewards performance and a heart that's tired of acting. Wondering if choosing to be real was the right decision, or if you've simply chosen a particularly beautiful form of isolation. The question that haunts your quiet moments isn't whether you made the right choice. It's whether anyone else out there is making the same one. There was something about Alan Watts that made him both deeply loved and perpetually misunderstood by his contemporaries. Here was a man who could fill lecture halls with seekers hungry for spiritual wisdom. Yet he often found himself eating alone, drinking alone, thinking alone, not because he was antisocial, but because he'd made the radical choice to be genuinely himself in a world that preferred spiritual teachers to be perfectly enlightened characters rather than beautifully flawed human beings. Watts understood something that our image-obsessed culture still struggles to grasp. The moment you stop performing spirituality and start living it, you often find yourself walking a lonelier path. He watched the spiritual seekers of his time, and he'd recognize the same pattern in us today, desperately wanting to be authentic while simultaneously terrified of what that authenticity might cost them socially. He'd experienced this firsthand as a young Anglican priest who gradually realized he could no longer pretend to believe things that didn't ring true in his bones. He could have stayed safe in his clerical collar, delivering sermons that satisfied his congregation's expectations, maintaining the comfortable fiction that he had all the answers. Instead, he chose the more difficult path of admitting his questions, his uncertainties, his very human struggles with meaning and purpose. This wasn't rebellion for rebellion's sake. This was something far more courageous, the quiet, persistent refusal to trade his inner truth for outer acceptance. And it cost him dearly. Professional relationships, social standing, the comfort of belonging to a clearly defined spiritual community. He found himself in that peculiar space occupied by truth-tellers throughout history, respected from a distance, but often too uncomfortable to invite to dinner. But Watts discovered something profound in that wilderness of authenticity. He realized that the loneliness of being genuine was actually a different kind of solitude, not the desperate isolation of disconnection, but what he came to understand as the natural state of being truly connected to yourself. He began to see that the choice between authenticity and approval wasn't really a choice at all. It was an invitation to discover what real connection actually feels. Like, he'd often talk about the difference between loneliness and aloneness. Loneliness was what happened when you tried to be someone else and failed to find genuine connection. But aloneness, the kind that comes from being completely honest about who you are, this was actually a form of wholeness. A coming home to yourself that made real intimacy with others possible for the first time. Watts saw that we'd created a culture of spiritual performance art, where everyone was so busy being the person they thought they should be, that nobody was actually meeting anybody else. We were all shaking hands with masks, falling in love with personas, building friendships with carefully curated versions of each other. But what if the very loneliness you feel when you choose authenticity isn't punishment for being real? What if it's actually the doorway to something you've been seeking all along? The possibility of being truly known. Starting with knowing yourself? Think of a lighthouse for a moment, not the romantic postcard version, but the reality of what it means to be a lighthouse. It stands alone on rocky shores, often battered by storms, surrounded by nothing but ocean and sky. Its purpose isn't to blend in with the landscape or to make friends with other buildings. Its purpose is simply to shine, consistently and authentically, especially in the darkest nights when that light matters most. The lighthouse doesn't question whether its light is too bright, too different, too inconvenient for ships that might prefer to navigate in darkness. It doesn't dim itself to make others comfortable or flash in patterns that might be more socially acceptable. It simply does what lighthouses do. It shines its authentic light, regardless of whether anyone notices, appreciates, or understands. Alan Watts lived this lighthouse principle before he ever articulated it. He understood that when you commit to being genuinely yourself, not the self that gets applause, not the self that fits neatly into social categories, but the self that emerges when you strip away all the performances, you're choosing a path that's inherently solitary. Not because you don't want connection, but because real connection can only happen between people who are actually present, actually themselves. We've created a culture where authenticity has become another performance, another way to gain approval. We curate our vulnerability, schedule our spontaneity, brand our brokenness in socially acceptable ways. We share our struggles in carefully measured doses, making sure our pain is palatable, our questions aren't too challenging, our truth isn't too uncomfortable for others to witness. But Watts saw through this spiritual theater with startling clarity. He recognized that true authenticity isn't a strategy for getting people to like you. It's often precisely what ensures some people won't. When you stop saying what people want to hear and start saying what you actually think. When you stop pretending to have answers you don't have and start admitting to questions that make others uncomfortable, you discover something both terrifying and liberating. Most relationships were built on the foundation of mutual pretending. Consider the wolf who lives at the edge of the forest. It doesn't try to domesticate itself to live comfortably in human society. It doesn't wonder if it would be more popular if it learned to bark like a dog or wag its tail on command. It lives according to its wolf nature, even if that means living on the periphery, even if that means being misunderstood or feared. The wolf's dignity comes not from being accepted by the village, but from being completely, unapologetically itself. This is what Watts meant when he talked about the pathless path. The recognition that spiritual authenticity often means walking away from the well-worn routes that everyone else seems to be following. Not because you want to be different, not because you're trying to be difficult, but because those paths simply don't match the rhythm of your own inner compass. He often spoke of his years in the Anglican Church, how he slowly realized he was performing Christianity rather than living whatever spiritual truth was actually alive in him. He could have stayed in that comfortable role, delivering sermons that confirmed what people already believed, offering spiritual comfort food that never challenged anyone to grow. The congregation loved him when he did this. He fit perfectly into the role of wise spiritual guide, saying the right things at the right times, maintaining the beautiful illusion that faith was supposed to provide easy answers. But something in him couldn't continue the performance, not because he wanted to rebel or shock anyone, but because he began to feel the profound loneliness of being loved for who he was pretending to be rather than who he actually was. That's perhaps the deepest loneliness of all, being surrounded by people who adore a version of you that isn't real. So he made the choice that all authentic, spiritual seekers eventually face. He chose to be genuinely himself, even if it meant losing the comfort of false connection. Even if it meant disappointing people who preferred the character he'd been playing. Even if it meant stepping into the unknown territory of being truly known. And what he discovered in that wilderness was extraordinary. The loneliness of authenticity, he realized, was completely different from the loneliness of performance. When you're performing, you're lonely because nobody can actually see you. They can only see your act. But when you're authentic, any loneliness you feel isn't because you're disconnected from others. It's because you're so deeply connected to yourself for perhaps the first time. Think about the last time you told someone exactly what you were really thinking, without editing it for their comfort or your safety. Remember that moment of vulnerability, that sense of standing emotionally naked in front of another person. Even if they didn't understand, even if they pulled away, wasn't there something profoundly liberating about being completely seen, completely yourself, even for just that moment? This is what Watts called the courage of being disliked, not the adolescent rebellion of trying to shock or offend, but the mature recognition that being genuinely yourself will inevitably disappoint people who've grown comfortable with your mask. Some will be threatened by your honesty because it reminds them of their own pretending. Some will be confused by your complexity because they preferred the simplified version of you that was easier to understand. Some will simply not resonate with who you actually are, and that's not a failure, it's just truth. But here's the paradox that Watts understood so beautifully. The more willing you become to lose false connections, the more available you become for real ones. When you stop performing, you create space for others to stop performing too. When you risk being disliked for who you really are, you open the possibility of being truly loved for who you really are. It's like a tuning fork that only resonates with instruments tuned to the same frequency. When you're authentic, you naturally repel people who aren't interested in authenticity and attract those who are. The quantity of connections may decrease, but the quality transforms completely. Watts often talked about the difference between being popular and being understood. Popularity requires you to be what others want you to be. Understanding happens when you're brave enough to be what you actually are and patient enough to wait for those who can recognize and appreciate that authenticity. The trees in an old growth forest don't all grow the same way. Some reach straight toward the sun, others twist and bend around obstacles. Some grow thick and sturdy while others remain slender and flexible. They don't try to conform to some ideal tree shape. They respond authentically to their unique circumstances, their individual relationship with light and water and soil. And somehow, this diversity creates a forest ecosystem more beautiful and resilient than any human-designed uniformity could ever be. You are not meant to be a perfectly shaped tree in someone else's spiritual garden. You are meant to grow according to your own inner nature, in response to your own unique circumstances, reaching toward whatever light calls to you most strongly. And yes, this might mean growing in ways that don't match the spiritual landscaping that others find comfortable or familiar. Loneliness you feel when you choose authenticity isn't evidence that you're doing something wrong. It's evidence that you're doing something rare. In a world full of people performing their lives for invisible audiences, your willingness to simply be yourself, is both an act of rebellion and an act of faith. It's faith that you are enough as you are. Faith that real connection is possible when it's built on truth rather than mutual convenience. Faith that the people who are meant to truly know you will recognize you when you stop hiding, even if it takes time for them to find you. The lighthouse doesn't worry about being lonely. It knows its purpose isn't to gather other lights around itself, but to shine its own light so purely that those who need it can find their way home. Here's what Alan Watts would want you to know, and what your heart already whispers in your quietest moments. Your loneliness is not a bug in the system, it's a feature. It's not evidence that you've chosen wrongly, but that you've chosen courageously. The solitude that comes from being genuine isn't punishment for refusing to wear a mask. It's the natural habitat of someone who's decided to live as their true self. You have permission, not from me, not from any external authority, but from the deepest wisdom of existence itself, to feel proud of your loneliness. Yes, proud. Because your willingness to stand alone rather than blend into the crowd of personas is perhaps the most generous gift you could offer this world. Every time you choose authenticity over approval, you're creating a small pocket of permission for others to do the same. Think of it this way. You are a living reminder that it's possible to be real in a world of performances. Your existence, your willingness to be uncomfortable rather than false, is like a lighthouse beam cutting through the fog of collective pretending. You may not know who sees that light, but trust that someone needs exactly the kind of authentic presence you're offering, even if they can't tell you so directly. The paradox Watts understood so deeply was this: the lonelier you become by being genuine, the more connected you actually are, connected to truth, to your own depths, to the raw reality of being alive rather than the polished fiction of having it all together. This isn't the desperate isolation of disconnection. This is the dignified solitude of integrity, your refusal to perform happiness when you're sad, wisdom when you're confused, or certainty when you're questioning. This isn't antisocial behavior. This is spiritual medicine for a culture that's overdosed on pretending. Every authentic moment you live is a small act of resistance against the tyranny of social expectations. And here's the secret that only those who've walked this path discover. The people who are meant to truly know you can only find you when you're actually being yourself. As long as you're performing, you're invisible to your true tribe. But the moment you risk being genuine, awkward, uncertain, beautifully human, you send out a signal that only authentic people can receive. The loneliness you feel isn't empty space waiting to be filled by more shallow connections. It's sacred space, cleared of everything false, waiting for something real to enter. It's the difference between a crowded room full of strangers and a quiet room waiting for a friend. You don't need to apologize for being too much or too little. For people who prefer their relationships simple and their friends predictable, you don't need to dim your complexity or amplify your agreeableness to make others comfortable. Your job isn't to be likable. Your job is to be real. And real is always more complicated, more nuanced, more challenging than likable. The courage you demonstrate every day, the courage to feel your actual feelings, think your actual thoughts, and be your actual self. This is the rarest kind of bravery. It's easier to climb mountains or start businesses than it is to simply be genuine in a conversation. It's easier to achieve external success than it is to admit internal confusion. So when you feel that familiar ache of not quite belonging, remember, you were never meant to belong to the crowd. You were meant to belong to yourself first, and then to those rare souls who recognize and celebrate the beauty of someone who's decided to be real. The lighthouse doesn't apologize for standing alone. It knows its solitude serves a purpose greater than its own comfort. And so does yours. Your authenticity is not a luxury you can afford because you're antisocial. It's a necessity because you're truly social, too genuinely interested in real connection to settle for anything less. Keep shining. Someone needs your particular light,